Hello everybody, it's me, Player Negative. Sorry to keep you waiting, and today I'm going to get into the topic of how Sega is slowly making a resurgence in the video game industry and is doing what Nintendo won't. Allow me to explain. Well, it's no surprise that Nintendo has kind of been anti-consumer for the past couple of years and weeks, with the current release of Mario's 40th anniversary, which, why that was an interesting time, how they repriced two different games was no short of greedy. And why me and many other YouTubers have made it our mission to make people more aware about it, to vote with their wallet and try to deal with it, we know inevitably there's gonna be that one majority of people who don't care. Despite that, though, where Nintendo is basically snacking every dollar out of your wallet, Sega is doing the exact opposite, slowly making a resurgence to picking themselves back up to be the very thing that might put Nintendo in their place. Allow me to explain. You see, why today Sega may be that third-party company that Sonic comes from and is known for many different titles, like the Persona series, the Yakuza series, and whatever the heck you call this monstrosity. But back in the 90s, it was a much different story, where Sega was actually the main person against Nintendo, constantly berating them during an event you may know as the console wars. Why, today, the war is slowly still evolving with the three main competitors. Back in the 90s, it was purely between these two competitors, Nintendo and Sega. And it's kind of what changed the concept of video games in general to something similar to that of a sporting event, where your favorite company was like your favorite sports team, and their main franchise was like the mascots. You see, back in the 90s, the Sega was like a phoenix rising from its ashes. The ashes in question being the Sega Master System, Sega's first 8-bit console. However, when they wanted to make a splash, when they wanted to make a statement against Nintendo, they created the Sega Genesis. All they needed were some good point strategy plans in order to beat the Mustache Man. And the man to turn to was none other than Tom Kalinske, the CEO of Sega of America. You see, one day on his family vacation, he was approached by an executive of Sega of Japan to become the CEO, come up with some marketing strategies in order to get the Sega Genesis out and about in America. To do that, he came up with a 5-point strategy plan that the Japanese market had no interest in and a very big lack of faith in. But regardless, they let him do it. First plan was simple. Drop the price of the console, introduce sports games that respect the rules and understanding of the games, and lastly, the most important one, create a mascot able to defeat Mario, and also support it to a more mature demographic. In this situation, this is where I have to introduce you to Yuji Naka, the creator, designer, and proud father of the Blue Blur himself. Now, when it came to designing Sonic, they knew they wanted something momentum-based, but when it came down to what he was going to be, they originally first thought of a rabbit based off its ability to run a little bit faster and the ears to pick up items. When that didn't work, they chose a panda. But also the fat chubbiness didn't mean they would move very fast. Then they chose an old man, which would later become the design for Dr. Eggman. Afterwards, and a lot of design, they eventually landed on a hedgehog due to the obscurity of the animal, and the fact that being able to roll up into a ball was part of the factor of the momentum. So, with their console and mascot at hand, they decided to take to America and show Nintendo what they could do.
Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
What you just witnessed was one of many of Sega's constant campaigns to try to dunk on Nintendo as well as show off their special hardware. Because while Nintendo had familiar titles, Sega is responsible for multiple game innovations that modern day is very familiar for. What innovations exactly? Oh, nothing, just wireless controllers, an online storefront, and the idea of online gaming. And to top it all off, you know those plastic cases that most of the time a disc or a cartridge would be put in after the events of the Super Nintendo? Yeah, they did that first too. But the hardware is useless unless you have the games to back it up, and boy did Sega have games. They had games like Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Bonzin Brothers, and they were a massive area for third-party games. So stuff like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, heck, even Mega Man got in on the action with a game called Mega Man The Wily Wars, which was both a collection and a third campaign mode to the first 4 Mega Man games. There was even a simple picture of Sega and Capcom's partnership representing Sonic and Mega Man shaking hands in the US. But like a lot of game companies in the 90s, all of this would shortly come to an end. Now, there are multiple factors to why Sega fell off, and one of the obvious contenders is the fact that Sega didn't have as many IP as Nintendo did, as well as another contributing factor, their horrible marketing strategies when it came to their newer 3D consoles. When they announced the Sega Saturn, they immediately stated that you could actually buy it right now, which not only was a dumb decision from a marketing standpoint, but just a dumb decision overall because it gave people very little time to prepare games for the consoles, to make sure they were even compatible with the hardware, and to even just do anything overall. Compared to consoles like the PS4 and the N64, the Sega Saturn was pretty weak. The Dreamcast, on the other hand, while it was a good console, the damage was already done. And a few years later, Sega announced they dropped out of the console wars. It felt like a bittersweet defeat or a sad end to an era. However, things weren't as hopeless until then. Due to the fact that Sega was now a third-party company, they could put games on all platforms without having to worry about exclusivity to one console, which is how you got games like Persona 5, Jet Radio, and the Yakuza series, like I stated before. However, when it came down to Sonic, things didn't exactly go well. You see, if you remember watching my videos talking about Sonic's overall development history, then you would know the 2010s were basically a minefield for the Blue Blur, because while some games like Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, when they got ported to the GameCube, were pretty well made, other games that came afterwards dealt with heavy criticism due to multiple YouTubers and the common factor that irony was just a bigger thing over sincerity, and you have a recipe for disaster. And this one meme I'm about to show you encapsulates it all pretty perfectly.
Frickin' bricks just can't ever be quenched. Your fantasies can't ever be quenched, can they? You frickin' bricks! When will you learn? When will you learn that your actions have consequences?
Now, I would like to take a moment to apologize to anybody in the audience who had sensitive ears, but basically that annoying meme was none other than the Frick Kid, or the Sonic fan rant kid. Basically, a meme about a fan of the Sonic franchise generally pissed off about the current state of things. And to be honest, who could blame him? Sonic was a former shell of what he once was, or at least that's how it was in the eyes of a lot of the fans, which led to a lot of controversy of how things fell apart. And anyone who's seen my videos would probably know that this lasted for a pretty long time, until the release of one of the worst Sonic games in the franchise, according to one of the fans. No, not 06 if you're wondering, but Sonic Forces. After this massive backlash, the writers of these newer Sonic games were fired, and the person who stepped in first to fix all this was Ian Flynn. But before that, Sega decided to do something that Nintendo would never do: publish a fan game. You see, unlike Nintendo, which will come running at you as you so much even try to make something that looks similar to their IP, Power World, Sega actually slowly over time has developed a strong trust with their community and actually decided to publish a Sonic fan game as their own work with respect to the original creator. And that game was Sonic Mania, the first in a long line of great moves in order to pull Sonic back into the limelight. Not only did the game have good level design, brought back a lot of the classic mechanics from people's favorite era of Sonic, it also brought back Ray and Mighty, two of Sonic's most oldest characters from back in the day. And why Mania was good, it would take a lot more than just one game to fix Sonic's 15 years of bad reputation and disappointments. Luckily, Sega managed to hire someone who not only understood these characters' rights, but also portrayed them in a way that would work without getting rid of everything that came before. This is Ian Flynn, one of the main artists and writers for the Sonic Archie comic series, and now is the main director for the stories of most of the games currently being made. Now, most people with a series as inconsistent and messy as Sonic would just smack the reset button and start from scratch. However, Ian Flynn, instead of resetting everything, did something else completely different. He made a game that acknowledged those failures and shortcomings and then pushed past them. And that game was Sonic Frontiers. A game with decent gameplay, sure, but a massively well-written story that reworked a lot of the problems with the franchise from the ground up. But this was not the first or the last the Blue Blur would get in his resurgence. Now, before I can talk about the next game that brings Sonic back into the limelight, I also have to explain that back during those 15 years of a bad reputation, there was one game that actually did do well. And that game was Sonic Generations, an anniversary game, but also a time-traveling story that had Sonic going through his best moments. So, you're probably thinking they simply just remade the game and put it on a modern console. And you'd be right. Half right anyway, because there was also another problem with the newer era of Sonic that people didn't like, and that was Shadow. You see, a problem with Sonic was a lot of the characters, and the factor that a lot of more modern writers along those 15 years portrayed and wrote every character very poorly. Shadow being no exception to this, but being the worst outlier of them all. So, what did Sega do? They decided to fix this by bundling this remake with Shadow's own new game that would follow a brand new campaign written like how older Sonic games was. And this game would be called Sonic X Shadow Generations. Now, when people saw this title, they were a little bit worried due to the fact that that name is also associated with some pretty messed up Google searches. But due to Sega having the control and the ability to recommend Google to remove that, that was one of the many reasons why the game was called that. Anyway, so the game itself had been reworked from the ground up to fit the more modern writing by Ian Flynn. But the second campaign was all his original idea due to the fact that Shadow was not only one of the most favorite characters among the Sonic community, but also the one that was the most poorly written over the years due to newer writers. So when they made this campaign, it was important that they got the story right. And they did not miss whatsoever.
Someone cooked here.
Which brings us towards today, with the newest Sonic game being on the rise, a racing game by the name of Sonic Racing Crossworlds. Now, this game was in development before Mario Kart World made their announcement. However, they weren't intimidated by it because they saw the path Nintendo was going down, and also no one's charging $80 for a game with a poorly made open world. And when the game was almost done, they released this ad, which was a remake of the old glass processing Sega Genesis ad that I showed you earlier. Take a look.
Racing game. It's great. We don't need to show it to you. But what if you can blast through and race on a whole nother level? What if you could warp across different dimensions, fully customize and build out your machine, and compete head-to-head across different platforms? Or what if you want to roam around on the open road?
This game is a sheer example of Sega choosing to listen to their consumer base and trying to make games that people actually want to play, that are worth its price. But if you think Sonic's the only one getting his day in the sun, you couldn't be more wrong. So remember these titles that I mentioned earlier that Sega forgot about and left to rot? Well, they decided to give these characters and these games the Sonic treatment by adding new entries to the series in a better graphical style in a short announcement that happened a few days ago. Take a look.
Yo. Did you save the game?
Really? Of course I did.
Let me reintroduce you.
So, how do you feel about the fact that Sega is slowly making a return, and that basically what has started off as a simple spark is a flame of a rekindled rivalry between two great sides coming back once again? I'm Player Negative, and I'm signing off. But before I do, I'm going to create a small poll on voting on which side you would think would have a fair chance against each other. So, are you on the side of Nintendo, or are you speeding for Sega? Go down to my channel's polls and vote now. I'm Player Negative, and I'll see you later.